Hey Groovers, this is Tim to introduce you to one of our favorite episodes from our 8-year history. We're sharing the top 8 episodes as bonuses in our run up to our 8th anniversary in October 2025. See that? The top 8 episodes, 8th anniversary. Got that? Okay, at the same time, we're celebrating the publishing of 500 episodes of Behavioral Groups. Because of both of these milestones, we're inviting you to join us for a celebration party in Minneapolis. Professor Nick Epley of the University of Chicago will be speaking live at the event and sharing observations from his lifelong work on happiness. We hope to see you there. And if you'd like to join us in Minneapolis, there's an invite in the show notes for this episode. Do join us. Okay, back to this episode. This is episode 365 from July 16th of 2023. It was with Dan Simons and Chris Chabris. They're psychology professors, and they've worked a lot on scams as well as how people see some things and don't see others. This episode is important and makes our top 8 because it reviews the importance of critical thinking. And the second thing is that it's got incredible insights on how deceptions and scams are successful and what you can do about them. This episode is presented in its original form, and we hope you use it this week to go out and find your groove.
Tim, do you like to be fooled? You know, hoodwinked, tricked, duped, misled, bamboozled, conned. You like that, don't you?
Oh, God, no. Of course not. I don't think anybody does.
No, agreed, right? There is almost this visceral response to being fooled, at least for myself, that feels like a violation of sorts.
Oh, totally. I've been there more than a few times over the years. You too, I'm guessing.
Oh, yes. Not proud of it, but yes, I have. And when I think about this tip from one of our guests in this episode, I think to myself, Kurt, there's no way that you would ever fall for this one. But just listen.
One of my favorite examples there is products being sold in unlikely venues. So if you think you might be interested in acquiring some nice artworks like fine art for your house or your collection or whatever, you should not buy them on cruise ships or infomercials on TV, right?
Right. But we do. Scams keep popping up because they work, at least to some degree. And they work because we humans have a natural tendency to believe what other people tell us. Even you, Tim. Even you. Yeah. I believe what you tell me.
And you should. Because when I'm scamming you, I don't want you to know.
All right.
Well, in our episode today, Kurt and I got to chat with a couple of our behavioral science heroes. Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris are the authors of Nobody's Fool, Why We Get Taken and What We Can Do About It. And they are also the creators of an impressive piece of tomfoolery that's known as the monkey business illusion. Now, we're not going to discuss it with them today. We're not going to talk about it anymore. But if this is unfamiliar to you, check out the link in the show notes to the monkey business illusion. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, definitely. And for this episode, we spoke with them about their new book and some of the psychological gates that get open when we hear or see certain things that are appealing to us, even though they may not be true. And we talk about some of the ways to avoid being scammed.
Yeah. By the way, spoiler alert. It's not about being skeptical of every interaction with every single human being in every encounter.
Well, not skeptical of every interaction, but maybe more skeptical than you were. So I'm probably a little bit more skeptical about what I listened and believe that you tell me, Tim, those important things, right?
Right.
No. Dan Simons is a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois, where he heads the Visual Cognition Laboratory. Because the implications of his work are so broad, he has a courtesy appointment in the Department of Advertising and the College of Business. His research explores the limits of awareness and memory, the reasons why often we are unaware of those limits, and the implications of such limits on our personal and professional lives. He is a very, very fine researcher.
Yeah, and cool guy.
Cool guy. They both are cool guys. Yeah.
Yeah. And Chris Chabris is a professor and co-director of the Behavioral and Decision Sciences program at Geisinger Health System. where he is also the co-director of the Geisinger Behavioral Insights team. Now, previously, Chris taught psychology at Union College and a little place up in Cambridge called Harvard University.
No, I think I might have heard of that.
Yeah, probably. And he's been a driving force in helping us understand the limitations of our decision making.
All right. So with that, Groovers, we invite you to sit back with a cool drink of skeptical reasoning and listen to our conversation with Dan and Chris.
Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, great to be here.
We are so happy to have both of you here. This is really a treat for us. And we're going to start with a speed round for both of you. Let's start with Dan on this one. Coffee or tea?
Coffee. Unless I'm in Britain and it's breakfast time. But otherwise it's coffee.
Context dependent. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Chris, where are you on coffee or tea?
Entirely on the coffee side, but I'm trying to cut back a little bit.
Okay.
Whereas I am not.
All right, Dan, you and me together here. I used to be there, and I'm just like, I needed it. I had to go get an extra cup before this here. All right. Again, to both of you, we'll start this time with you, Chris. Dinner with your favorite actor or musician?
You mean I have to pick actor or musician, or I have to give an actual name?
Well, let's start with the
just
category.
actor or musician. We don't. We'll let you flub on the name at this point.
Oh, I don't know. Wow, that's a tough one. I guess I'd have to go with. Boy, that's a tough one. I guess I'll go with musician just to keep things rolling.
Okay. Well, I hope this is the hardest question that we have today. There you go. All right.
Dan?
Yeah, I'm stumped. I'd say actor.
Actor.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I have no idea which actor.
Okay. So we won't dig into who on either of these, but we got there. All right.
Okay. All righty. So I'm going to direct this one towards Dan. In Brave New World, Aldous Huxley famously claimed that 62,400 repetitions make one truth. Was he pretty close to being correct in that calculation?
Well, I mean, it probably would make a truth, but I don't think you need that many. Yeah.
He doesn't need that many. Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a phenomenon that we talk about in the book called the illusory truth effect.
Yes.
Where really just one repetition sometimes can change how much people believe something. Whether it makes it a truth or just shifts people's belief a little bit is a difference. But yeah, repetition works. Yeah.
Excellent.
I found that part was surprising to me. I knew that repetition, obviously, that is a piece of kind of people believing things. But anyway, we can talk about that later. This is a speed round. We got to get there. All right. We're going to go with Chris now here. True or false? Once a result is accepted into a peer-reviewed literature, 10 times as much evidence or more can be required to get a contrary finding published.
I would say absolutely true. Although, of course, it really depends on, exactly what finding and what the evidence is and so on. But yes, generally it takes a lot more counter evidence to rebut something than it does to get it established in the first place.
Yeah, which is really an interesting facet that you guys bring up in the book. And we are talking with Dan and Chris today about their new book called Nobody's Fool, Why We Get Taken and What We Can Do About It. And so with that, I just want to start with, actually, let's go, Chris, back to you again. What were you hoping for readers to get out of this book? Obviously, you guys have written books together before, but what was the impetus for this book and what were you hoping readers to get?
Well, I'd say the impetus for this book was we wanted to write another book because the first one we liked quite a bit, and I think we liked the process of writing it. I certainly enjoyed writing it as compared to working on, all the other things that academics do and so on. It was much different, and I've always liked trying to explain what we know and what we don't know, for that matter, to a broader audience than just our colleagues. And I think we'd been thinking about doing it again because the first one did pretty well, thinking about doing it again. And it was only really late in the process, which has been 13 years long since the previous book came out.
Wow. So just a short little bit of time between those. Okay.
Late in the process, like 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, when Dan actually suggested that the focusing on deception and fraud and scams would really unify the ideas we'd been working with much better than they had been unified before. We had previous working titles, previous outlines, and so on, but centering it on scams, misinformation, cheating, deception, and so on really, I think, brought it together, and also was especially timely for, reasons that might be obvious these days, or we can discuss, in more detail later. As for what we want people to get out of it, I would really like people to understand the nature of deception and cheating and cons, which is something that we talk about so much, and there's so much literature and movies and shows and podcasts devoted to these stories. Understand the nature of it more deeply from the point of view of the people who are the victims. Because a lot of this stuff that we see focuses a lot on the dashing con artists. They must be geniuses. Are they psychopaths? The poor victims, they lost everything, they're suffering, but not so much on why they got conned in the first place. And it's not, it's not like every con is unique. There are recurring patterns and ideas and habits, and we could talk about all that. But really, we wanted to give that idea that there's like a cognitive psychology of this thing, and you can understand it, and it might help you.
Dan, was there a specific item? Was there a specific event or something that you noticed that was like, wait a minute, this is what we have to talk about. This is what we should go after.
Not really. I mean, we'd been compiling themes, and many of the themes that we'd been compiling over the last 13 years ended up in the book in some form, and maybe another equivalent amount didn't. But a lot of those sorts of themes, we had other organizations and other structures for them that kind of worked and kind of didn't, and we could get some of the things that we wanted in, and the framing just didn't quite work. So really, the theme of deception, it worked because it brought together the two different elements of the book that we were trying to get in. One was these sort of tendencies, thought processes, what we call habits, that are really effective and efficient most of the time. And that's really a kind of a central point, is that these are all things that are for the most part, really good, right? We want to be able to do these things. And we're able to most of the time. So it was able to bring together those habits, and then also the kinds of information that we find really appealing, and why, right? What we call hooks. And by bringing those two things together, both of those are, the organization for us was, both of those can be hijacked. Right? Both of those can be used by people who are trying to fool us. And we kind of realized that it all came together that way, that if you look at all these scams and cons that we've been accumulating over the years as good examples of how cognition is working, they all kind of had that element to them. They all relied on the same sorts of principles and the same sorts of ways, with new variants all the time.
Yeah. Chris, you mentioned that the book's release and the timing kind of are pretty relevant given some of the things going on. You said maybe we can get into that. Let's get into that. So what are some of those pieces that, as we think about the topic that you guys are talking about, this idea of deception, fraud, various different pieces. And I know there's some particularly in the science world that, that we work in, the research world, but I think even in general, there's probably some other aspects that come into play. So help us, expand upon that.
I would say there's a number of threads that sort of lead me to think that this is an especially timely topic. One, as you mentioned, science fraud and generally bad research practices in science. I would say 20 years ago, I was not very much aware of them. I knew about some things, but when you would read about a story, like, for example, Jan Hendrik Schoen, who's someone we talk about in the book, who basically published many fraudulent papers in Science and Nature, the sort of two top journals we have in all of science, those seem like the dramatic exceptions to the rule. Like, this is the craziest thing ever. Like, nobody else is doing that. But as time went on, more scientific fraud has been revealed, and the scale of it has been revealed to be larger than many people thought. I don't think it means you shouldn't trust science or anything like that, but just we need to be aware of the fact that in science there is fraud, just like there is in pretty much every other domain of life. So that became more apparent. I think also there's been a sense that even in business, for example, that practices that formerly might have been considered deceptive or over the edge or whatever have become sort of part of routine business. There have been books about, hedge funds that sort of try to establish clever systems for garnering and disseminating and using inside information while basically shielding everybody from legal liability somehow. And, that didn't used to be sort of the standard MO. That was considered a big exception. And there's even the growth of businesses whose sort of business model is providing tools for cheating.
Yeah.
New AI technologies like large language models and really good chatbots have tremendous potential there, which is obvious. I'm not saying those were created for that purpose, but they certainly make it easier. So technology making cheating easier, noticing that it's happening more, it may be becoming more accepted in certain domains. And of course, the spread of course, I would say the rise of misinformation and disinformation also enabled by technology like the internet. And there are many more probably that I'm not thinking of, but these are some of the things that I think are all, sort of coming together now and make it more important that we be aware of how this works and how we're vulnerable to it.
Just to amplify that, over the last few years, of course, we've been dealing with a lot of virtual interaction, right? And that's led to a lot more online presence, and identity theft and things like that are increasing a lot because we're constantly online. The AI thing is going to be, all of these are going to be capitalizing on the same sorts of principles, just in new ways, right? So there's a terrible scam going around right now, and it's not new, but it's more kind of evil in some ways than a lot of the other sort of just make money scams, which is that people target a grandparent or a parent and pretend to be calling on behalf of their kid who's been in an accident or is in some sort of a crisis and needs money urgently. And it preys on fears. It preys on that sort of immediacy. And they do enough digging to find out about the person, right? So that they can kind of sound like they know. This is the standard tactic for a lot of sort of call center scams. They learn enough about you from your online presence that they can target you. But think about what AI is going to do to that. We're not that far off from having pretty good voice synthesis if you've got recordings of yourself online. And if you've got good voice synthesis, imagine how much more effective it is if the grandparent getting this call, if the caller has the grandchild's voice, right? It's that much worse. So you have to kind of think about ways of, short-circuiting those sorts of scams and thinking about how they're going to capitalize on your immediacy of fear and or desires. Right? And a lot of scams capitalize on your desires. These are capitalizing on your fears.
Got to admit that the book, there's a lot of evidence in the book to make us makes me want to be more skeptical. To be more careful, right? Which is hopefully one of the reasons why you're writing it is to put the warning out there. But on the highest level, who can we trust?
You can trust us.
Trust me.
Thank you, Mr. Nixon.
Anybody that says trust me, that's the people that you can trust, right?
We're starting a very long con right now with this podcast. So
it's not clear where it's going or where we get at.
We don't know where it's going, but we know it's starting.
We're playing into your evil scheme.
Exactly.
No, but Chris, how do we parse that out? How do we sort of say, is there any source that we're just going to say it's likely to be reliable? It's sort of okay to just drop our concerns about this particular source, this particular messenger, for instance.
Well, I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think, for any kind of relationship where you think really one ought to be able to trust that person, you can find examples where such people were, scamming and cheating and conning and so on, right? Even in the closest relationships we have, spouses, children, grandparents, and so on, you're going to find examples where that was basically hijacked, and became a vector of fraud and cheating and so on. On the other hand, we can't go through life being, hyper skeptics, who never form any relationships with anyone, never believe anything we read, never make any investments, never, whatever. There needs to be some kind of balance. So I'm not sure it goes
it goes against our DNA. I mean, that would be really hard to do.
Yes, and I'm not sure there's any category of people that you should always trust. Like one might think, religious leaders, but of course there have been some of those who have been completely untrustworthy. One might, so it doesn't go category by category, right? I think part of our message of our book is that, all of us are vulnerable somehow. There's always situations that, where we might be, exploitable, even within our own fields of expertise, right? Someone clever can come along and craft a con like scientific fraud. Scientific fraud cons people who are experts in the science. So it really is about not so much thinking like, when are we safe, but how do we manage our skepticism so that we apply it, when the stakes are the highest.
I'll just amplify that, the vast majority of the time, we can trust people, right? These scams wouldn't work if we were always skeptical of everybody all the time. And we couldn't function if we were always skeptical of everybody all the time. So they only work because, of course, most of the time people are honest. Most of the time people are not trying to fool us or steal from us. Most people are good. So, if you kind of take the message that you should always be skeptical, that's absolutely the wrong message, right? That the vast majority of the time, it just doesn't matter that much, right? And it's really being aware of those times when it does matter, when the consequences are big, that we need to be maybe a little bit more skeptical.
I thought for sure you guys were going to say politicians. We could trust them pretty much every single time. Don't worry about them. Other people, maybe not so much. But all right. I guess that's not the case. So I do want to get into some of as you guys mentioned before we got on air, you said lots of people were asking about the last couple chapters. And again, a lot of that is around the scientific community and some of the pieces that were coming up there. So as we think about the replication crisis, and, you can call it crisis or just what's going on within science overall, you write about like how this is going on, but is there anything that we can do, to kind of look at first? Can you describe how you guys think about this? Cause it's slightly different than I think, lots of people that are out there that are talking about the replication crisis as we go. And then talk a little bit about, some of the things that you bring up in the book and how we can remedy this, or ways that we can be thinking about this, at least in a different manner. And Dan, why don't you start with that?
Yeah. So, this is something I've been thinking about and working on for many years, right? So I actually edited one of the psychology journals that was recently founded that focuses on things like reproducibility and methods. And I think a lot of people view this not so much as a crisis as an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
I view it as the credibility revolution, right? That these problems have been around, right? It's not like they've suddenly emerged, right? These are problems that we've had in the literature, not just in psychology, but in pretty much all of the sciences. Psychology is among the first to kind of introspect and realize that there was a problem. But this is true in every field that anybody's looked at, that there are problems with credibility due to questionable methods and reporting and analysis practices. But I'm actually really optimistic for the first time about this. I've known about these problems for going on 30 years. If you look back in the history of statistics and methodology, which is, very exciting literature. But if you look back into it, every 20 years or so, people raise the same concerns. Right? This is not a new phenomenon, but they never caught on. And this is one of those times where the mass communication, the internet, the ability to communicate and identify criticisms publicly and quickly has radically changed how the field is viewing this. So this time it caught on. Right? People realized, okay, there actually are some big problems. There was a confluence of a whole bunch of events at once that kind of triggered this sort of reflection. And I think there are solutions, which is the great part, right? There are some great tools now for making science more credible.
So talk a little bit about some of those tools and
Sure. Yeah.
I'll let you go on. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, any tool has flaws. Any tool can be gamed, right? Any criterion can be played. But there's some techniques that kind of work the way we think science works and the way that most people in the public think science works. So most people think of science as, hey, you have this idea, you have this hypothesis or theory that you want to test. Right? You set up an experiment and you lay out, hey, if it comes out this way, that's going to mean this. If it comes out this way, it's going to mean this other thing. Let's see where the evidence takes us. And that's not how science has worked most of the time. Most of the time, people kind of have a rough idea. They collect some data. They think about a story they can tell with the data, and then they tell their story and kind of link it all back together after the fact, which we now know is really problematic. So there's a new model of publishing that's emerging called registered reports. And the whole idea is you write out the introduction for your paper, motivate what you're going to do for your study. You write out the methods and say, here's what we're going to do. And then you write out how you're going to analyze the data and what different patterns of results would tell you. And that's what gets reviewed. That's what gets peer reviewed, because then you're evaluating, is this a study that's going to provide compelling evidence one way or the other, right? So that's the stage of primary review. And for anybody who's done kind of a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, that's what happens there, right? You propose what you're going to do. Your committee says, nah, that's a dumb idea. Let's fix it and do it this way. Right. And then you do it and you get your end result, right? And that kind of ends up being the thesis regardless of how it came out. Well, this move to change how publishing works is taking off. It's this sort of model first started around 2013 or so, and now there are more than 100 journals that accept this sort of research format. Some of the major journals are starting to. That eliminates so many of the problems because it's no longer an evaluation based on how well it fits what you want to have happen. It's an evaluation based on whether it's a good study.
Well, and it's for the researchers, it's no longer, I have to tell a good story to get published, right? It's
Exactly.
that is the piece again, where there was that publication bias on, hey, it's novel, it's unique, it's different, and it's, it's going to be something that gets talked about. And that takes that away. And you're going to probably, I'm assuming, and you might have seen this, but, a lot more, oh yeah, this hypothesis didn't turn out like we thought. We're going to get a lot more of the negative, results published. One of the things you said in your book, and I think this is looking backwards, maybe not so much looking forward, but, and I love this quote just because, and I don't know which of you wrote it or if you even remember, but, you state, this: in psychology and other social sciences, many studies lack a suitable, powerful telescope to provide reliable answers to their empirical questions. And in looking back, I mean, do you feel like many of these issues that kind of come up are because sample size and just the power of these studies is just too small? And you look back at studies from the 80s and you're going, they did this with 18 people. It's like one class and they're all college age students and all of those pieces. I don't know, and maybe it was just me, but I really love that sentence and just wanted to get your guys' thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say it depends on the kind of claim, right? So, I think we should be really wary of claims that are likely to vary across people and across contexts if you have a tiny little sample of people from one really restricted group. I mean, that's not going to lead to a general conclusion that's robust and that's meaningful. There are disciplines where a small number of participants is just fine. So if you're studying visual perception and you're interested in how our perceptibility of an object changes as you increase its contrast to the background, and you systematically vary the contrast to the background, and you have each person do tens of thousands of trials of this, right? Those results are going to be robust with 2 or 3 people, right? Because most people have the same kind of contrast mechanisms in their early visual processing, right? It's not varying hugely across context or people. You can measure it really systematically to the point that the error bars are smaller than the dots plotting the average value. I've literally seen that at a conference presentation. The error bars were smaller than the dots because there's just so much data. But it's a different kind of question, right? If you're interested in individual differences or group differences, you need big samples, right? If you're interested in the function for an individual person and showing that, hey, that everybody has pretty much the same function, whether or not it shifts up and down, then no, you probably don't. But those are very limited fields, right?
I'm curious, and Chris, I want to put this over in your neck of the woods here. We talked to many behavioral scientists on this podcast. We've had guests who have had papers retracted, as a matter of fact, and so this. Forgive me if this sounds a little bit self-serving, but there's a part of me sort of wondering, like, are there questions that we could ask up front, or is there a way that we approach those kinds of discussions that might that's better for the listeners in 170 countries?
No, I'm really curious about to go back and listen to those interviews and figure out who those folks were. That's a really good question. I think it's not always obvious when, some kind of data fraud or image manipulation or whatever has happened. But there are, some signs that you can look at in the papers to sort of detect certain kinds of fraud. Now, whether you then want to begin your interview by throwing that back at the guest and saying, I noticed in table 2 of your recent paper, that there's p-values are all suspiciously close to 0.05, and they're never like 0.01 or, I don't really know how you want to approach that with the guests, but certainly there are some signs that, that fraud may have occurred, but they're not necessarily easy to find. Like, for example, going back to image manipulation, right? Often image manipulations that are done, and image manipulation happens when a figure is published in a paper that doesn't represent the true results of the experiment that it's purported to represent, but it's some kind of modified image from a different paper or a different experiment or something that is made to look like it would have looked like if those results had come out that way. Those can take real experts to tell how they're similar to others, how they were changed, and so on. That's not necessarily easy. And some of the scientific fraudsters who had the greatest number of papers retracted were sort of detected by looking at fairly subtle characteristics of data, like correlations among variables that weren't even necessarily published in the main part of the article. I would love to hear what Dan's tips are for sort of just detecting fraud in papers or in interviews for that matter. But the one thing I would say is right, when people before hearing what Dan says, when people have too good a story and everything they tell you like worked out exactly right, and all their results are significant and none of them fail and so on, like that should be a sign that something weird is going on, because in the human sciences, like things don't usually work that way. There's too much variability, especially with small sample sizes, to get such consistency, right? At that level of consistency should really start to open your mind to the possibility that something else is going on here besides what the story is that we're being told.
Yeah. Dan, before you answer, I just want to expand that just beyond fraud even. It just is in some of these cases, I don't think, I'm pretty confident that it's not fraud. It just is they've papers that didn't replicate in various different pieces. And I think we're much more likely to probably interview those people, hopefully, as opposed to fraudsters. But
well, when you said retracted, I sort of immediately assumed that fraud was involved, because usually you don't retract a paper merely because someone else couldn't replicate it. I mean, maybe because you couldn't replicate it, you might retract it, but then even then there's a suspicion that something went wrong, in the initial process, not that it was just like an accidental, false positive.
Yeah. And I think it's very dangerous to associate fraud with false results, right? Results that just don't hold up. And because fraud implies intent, right? And especially earlier, I mean, now there's a gray area, right? Now we know what practices are questionable. But if you go back before, say, 2010, right? A lot of people were trained to use practices that we now know are bad. Right, that we now know are much more likely to generate false results. They're just not going to be true. And just because you found a p less than 0.05 doesn't mean it's true. And people didn't understand that. People took p less than 0.05 as truth, even if they fudged things around a lot to get to that 0.05.
P hacking going on data. That wasn't necessarily, as you said, they were taught that way, right?
And even unintentional p hacking, right? Even p hacking also implies intent.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
You're deliberately trying to. I think a lot of people just didn't realize how. Oh, well, we threw out outliers that were way far out, but that didn't get the result we want. So let's throw them out when they're a little closer, right? And forget that you've changed and looked at it multiple ways. That alone can increase your false positive rate. But people had no idea that all of these sorts of practices, and I think a lot of people, you could say, they just didn't know, right? They weren't trained in modern methods and statistics. They just didn't know. They were trained by their advisors who did the same thing, right? So I think that's the danger is, assuming that there was bad intent. I don't think there necessarily is. It's often just people don't remember what it was that they did exactly, report it the way that they, the story that worked nicely 2 years later, right? The other thing that has changed a little bit, though, is now that people are aware of these practices, if they continue to do those things, then we're into a gray area where there's some intent. And, you never know whether they're just still oblivious or whether it's willful blindness or whether it's, intent. But, so I tend to prefer staying away from accusing of fraud or misconduct, instead say using questionable practices, right? Because those questionable practices might, if there is intent behind them, become fraud, or they might just be bad research practices, or they might just, and occasionally you just get a result that's wrong, which should happen some of the time, right? Even if the research is perfectly done. If you do the same study a whole bunch of times, unless it's just an absolutely massive study, if you do it over and over again, some of the times it's just not going to work by the definition of working.
You bring up this idea of how they were trained, how the researchers were trained, and their colleagues. There's sort of a question of I don't want to make this sound too harsh, but I sort of accountability. Like, at what point do the PhD advisors play a role in making sure that the PhD students are just being more careful and being more thoughtful, and sort of the committee is saying, well, wait a minute, why, just because we've got a p less than 5.05, why is that okay? What does is there a sort of enough pushback early on to sort of breed an environment of, we're going to be more rigorous about this?
I think these days the problem goes in the other direction. Oh. It's normally the advisors who are the problem, and the younger researchers, the earlier career researchers who get it. Right. So, imagine you're in a lab that has, 8 grad students and a couple of postdocs. And the only time you ever get sort of positive feedback from your advisor is when you bring in a result that's perfectly what they want for their theory. Right. What's the incentive structure there? Right. That's a really hard problem. So, yeah, I mean, I think the field's changing in that way, but I think that was probably the source of a lot of the questionable results in the literature, that people are setting up an incentive structure where you have to bring in the next big flashy thing, and that's what generates excitement. And if you don't get that, then you didn't have flair and you weren't able to, do good work.
Yeah, I think there's I'll make 2 points. One is there's always the tension between individual choice and the so-called incentives, right? And, it's kind of incentives all the way down, right? Because if your salary is based on your ability to get grants, your ability to get grants is based on your ability to generate positive results. Your ability to generate positive results is based on your ability to have grad students who bring you, right? It's like there's incentives all the way down, but that's to me like not an ultimate excuse, because you could justify almost any behavior by saying there were incentives. And I don't have a grand society level solution to this problem, except maybe to somehow do something to divorce researchers and scientists' job security from their ability to get, publications in Nature and Science and $1 million grants. Yeah. There are some, and if I think we don't want to leave anyone with the impression that, psychological science or psychological science in the U.S. is the locus of this problem. It's actually, as Dan said, the bright spot. If you compare, sad to say, medical research or, scientific research in certain other countries where researchers are literally paid per paper they get into certain top journals based on the impact factor, which is a much more attenuated relationship here in the U.S. than it is there. You see the problem magnify. And also the training is worse, I would say, in many of these other fields, right? So there are papers showing how in neuroscience, elementary statistical errors have been made for decades that at least psychology researchers are taught not to do in like the first month of their stats course, right? So I'm referring to like not testing for an interaction, but claiming that, the presence of one effect and the absence of another, at the statistical threshold sort of shows you an interaction. But there's many examples like that if you look at the exciting literature on statistics and, and so on that Dan pointed out, you can find. There are a lot of interesting papers which are interesting because they point out how many times in respectable publications these standards are violated, but it's worse outside of psychological science really than within. So in part of my other work, my day job doing actual scientific research instead of writing about it, I have been making sort of the conscious attempt to commend people on our teams for doing a great analysis, executing a great study, like doing everything perfectly so that we have confidence in the result, whatever it is, right? That's really what we should be, emphasizing is like, let's make sure that the experiment answers the question or at least gives us data that, we can interpret clearly, as opposed to giving, quote, the right result.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
Another thing related to this is normalizing that it's okay when things fail and it's okay to be wrong, right? And this is actually something that Chris has done a lot on with a paper about this. You should talk about that, Chris, because it's your paper.
I'll very briefly. There's a paper that I was sort of involved in conceptualizing and contributing to that described something called the loss of confidence project. So we noticed that there's a famous study that got a lot of publicity about something called power posing, which you and our readers may have heard of, and after that study became controversial, one of the authors of it published a statement basically not retracting the paper, but basically stating that she didn't believe the results anymore and essentially had lost confidence in these findings, which appeared under her own name. And we thought maybe there are more researchers who, have publications on their, on their CV and out there in the world, but that they have sort of just discovered over time or were not done correctly or should not be believed anymore. So we got about 13 other researchers to ultimately contribute their own sort of loss of confidence statements. And we did a survey showing that this is relatively common, actually. Just as sort of questionable research practices are more common than people thought, I think researchers no longer having confidence in their own studies is somewhat common. And as Dan says, we should try to normalize it and make it acceptable to admit that, rather than having to sort of project this unreasonable confidence that everything you've ever published must still be correct.
Does it come down into self-identity too for some of that, though? I mean, people put a lot of time, energy, their reputation. I am this person, right? Along that line. How much does that play into what, that kind of hesitancy to kind of go, yep, I don't believe this anymore, and I believe something else?
It's hard. I mean, saying that you're wrong is hard, right? And acknowledging that you're wrong is hard. I mean, it's what we're supposed to be trained to do as scientists, but we're also people, right? That, if you've spent the last 15 years of your career promoting an idea and the evidence starts undermining it, it's really hard to say, nope, I was wrong for those 15 years.
Yeah.
Right. All of that work that I did wasn't right. That's a not trivial thing to do.
And if you want a sign for like who you should trust, going back to an earlier question, maybe people who routinely admit when they're wrong might be, a positive signal. It's true that some cheaters are clever. Like some of them will do things like, deliberately, like, create a situation to show that they made a mistake or something like that, in order to sort of gain your confidence, gain your trust. But if someone routinely does it in contexts where it doesn't seem like they're running a con, or they're not trying to sell you something, they're not trying to persuade you of something, but they're just that kind of person over long enough interactions, I would say you might be able to trust them more often. Their statements probably are better calibrated to reality if they're willing to admit they might be wrong.
Here's another sign, right, along the same lines. Do people constrain their claims?
Oh.
So in psychology, we often do studies on a bunch of undergrads. But even then, even when we broaden it beyond that, if you look at the titles of papers and the abstracts of papers, you would think that these tiny little effects apply to the universe at large in all contexts, in all situations, and they're totally unconstrained. And looking for the willingness to constrain your claims, say, okay, we know that this applies for this population under these conditions. We think it might for these other ones, but we don't know. That should give you more credibility, right? Because you're basically saying we don't know, when instead of trying to oversell it. When something gets hyped, right, in the media, and we see this all the time in psychology, you end up seeing a press release that makes these amazingly grandiose claims. This is the first paper to ever do this. And look how important this is. And more often than not, it's nonsense, right? It's a tiny little twist on something that was fairly well established. And even then, it's like, okay, it's a contribution. Make it just a contribution. Don't make it the end of, the greatest discovery, in the world.
Yeah. God, thank you for sharing that. That's a great little epistle to as a soundbite, just to kind of keep in my mind. Chris, I want to ask you about the bullshit receptivity that you guys talk about, because first of all, it's a great title. I mean, it's good. It's always good to use catchy names, and bullshit receptivity is a pretty catchy idea, but it's an important one. And so could you tee it up for us? Tell us a little bit about it. And Dan, you might have some thoughts about why it's so important as well.
Yeah, I want to start by saying that we did not invent that phrase. That comes from a paper by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand and maybe other co-authors. I forget. And you should definitely have them on if you haven't ever before to talk about this. But but in a nutshell, I think it's an important concept when it comes to being cheated and scammed, because one of the ways people can convince us of things that aren't true is by feeding us bullshit as opposed to actual useful information. So, bullshit is sort of information which is doesn't really have a discernible truth value or falsity value, but it seems like it could be useful information. It seems like it might mean something. So in the bullshit receptivity scale research, they used statements by, I believe, Deepak Chopra, who is prone to making statements that sort of sound weighty and important, but upon closer examination don't appear to actually mean anything. They're almost they're in a way sort of like a forerunner of stuff that a language model could have created, maybe, on a bad day.
Right.
And what the research found was that if you give people a bunch of these statements and ask them to evaluate them, some people are sort of find more meaning in them than others do, and those people also have some other characteristics. I think plausibly they might be more likely to be influenced by certain kinds of marketing and other appeals and cons and so on than people who don't appreciate that kind of language, as much.
I was going to say, one of the real challenges, one of the things we emphasize a bit in the book is the need to sort of ask one more question at times. So before forwarding that meme or that story that sounds exactly like what you want to believe, just pausing for a second, saying, is that really true?
Yeah.
Right. And just like, what evidence would I need to know if that were true? Can work in a lot of times to just slow you up just enough that you stay uncertain. But the problem with bullshit is you can't ask that question. Right? Is that really true? Doesn't really have a yes, no answer. Right. So you end up not being able to, dismiss it as easily. So it is a sign. You can tell that something is bullshit if you couldn't answer, is that true? And you can't say yes or no. Yeah, it might not be.
If you say, could that even be false? And the answer is, I don't know. Like, if there's no possible truth value, true or false, right, then maybe it's bullshit. Right?
You also talk about this tips on evading selection, kind of this piece. And when I read this, I'm like, oh, this sounds like a Talking Head song lyric, right? You talk about...
You might ask yourself.
Exactly. What am I doing? How did I get here? Right? Help our listeners understand some of the tips that they can be thinking about and what you can bring up from that perspective.
One of my favorite examples there is products being sold in unlikely venues. So if you think you might be interested in acquiring some nice artworks like fine art for your house or your collection or whatever, you should not buy them on cruise ships or infomercials on TV. Right. So, and those are two very specific tips, that you can take from this book. And if nothing else, maybe those will save you a lot of money, because it turns out that there were, businesses selling, these supposed giclée works, which are sort of machine printed reproductions of works, but maybe slightly embellished by the artist or signed by the artist, to indicate that it's a signed limited edition. And it turns out in some cases there's true fraud where the artist's signature is being applied by an automatic pen and they don't even know what's going on, or the artist's signature was applied to the paper maybe years before the work was printed onto it, and so on. So in no sense are they really associated with the artist in the sense in which you might, derive, some kind of value from it. And those are often sold in these sort of a little bit dodgy venues, right? So, what am I doing here? It can be a question that tells you, like, why am I buying art on a cruise ship? I should be buying art in an art gallery, or maybe in an auction, or maybe from a reputable seller online even, or something like that, where there are, ways that you can try to verify the authenticity. Of course, fraud can happen in any kind of art venue. And in fact, the art world is sort of especially prone to fraud because art is a good way of laundering money and hiding assets and so on. But it's also a good venue because a lot of the cognitive issues we identify in the book, can apply to our being taken in, by deception and in art. But what am I doing here is sort of, and also why me, right? Yeah. So when you get one of these crazy emails that has typos and grammatical errors and so on, and you think this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen, well, you're just discovering that the scam is not targeted at you. Like, you are not one of the people who in fact, they don't want to engage you. They want you to throw it away, because if you bother to engage with them, you're only going to waste their time, right? That they could be productively scamming someone, more vulnerable, Whereas you're talking to them, you're never going to send them money because you can tell this is a scam. If you engage, you're just wasting their time. And that's in fact a way to try to, fight back against these folks, is to waste their time, by interacting with them, but then never following through.
Yeah. I mean, phishing emails are basically a more mundane version of the, buy art on a cruise ship model, right? That they purport to be legitimate, right? And if you're not pausing and saying, wait, why would I get an email from my department head asking me to buy gift cards, right? You wouldn't, but if you don't stop to think about it and you trust that person and they give you some information that sounds right, because of course they find information about you before targeting, then that's going to be very effective, right? But these selection mechanisms, the scammers get better at this, right? So in the call center scams, where people would call up and threaten people to be deported, or say they owe back taxes and tell them to go buy gift cards and tell them the code numbers. If anybody ever asks you to buy a gift card at a Walgreens or something and read off a card number, it is a scam, right? That's never going to be a legitimate way of conveying money. But people are afraid, and they catch people who are not aware of the sorts of risks. And there are lots of variants of these, but they've gotten better and better. So now what they do is they use robocalls. So rather than sending an email with a whole bunch of, gibberish in it to try and filter, they use robocalls and give a callback number. Anybody who calls back has self-selected into the scam, right? You automatically, if you get a call for, extending your warranty on your car, you hang up, right? But anybody who calls back that number, they're a target.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, everyone remember that no U.S. governmental agency collects money by prepaid gift cards that you read the numbers off on a phone call. That is not a thing. So there's another easy way to save your money.
I need to go check something really quick while you guys. I need to get that gift card back. So
yeah.
Too late.
Damn it!
Too late. They moved the money.
Yeah,
God.
You got like 15 minutes once you read that card
they move
number
the
off.
money around really fast in those scams, right? Because they know that it could be taken back. So they do a lot of money laundering steps to get that money out of there as fast as they can.
It's a lot of work. It just feels like it's a lot of work to be a scammer.
It's a lot of work. But in a lot of these call center ones, they've got, these are large organizations. Like, these are not a couple of random guys doing this. Like, the guys you actually talk to are employees with managers who've got bosses who report to the owner. It's true. Like, these are industries. Like, this is an industry.
It's large scale organized scamming. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, to bifurcate a bit away from scamming, I'd like to just talk, if we could, a little bit about what your life would be like on a desert island for a year. Let's say you go to individual desert islands. All right, you're not on the same desert island. I know you guys get along famously, but you're on separate desert islands, and with you get to take two musical artists' catalogs. All the music that musical artist has ever created. So it's not just one song or one record or anything like that, but you get to take two with you. And Dan, you're looking pretty confident, so I'm going to ask you first, because Chris still has that look of, I don't know if I want to answer this one. What two artists would you take with you, Dan?
Well, I want to pick somebody who has a huge catalog that I mostly like, right? So,
good start. Yep.
Ani DeFranco would be one.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Just it's varied enough, and the albums are coherent. The second one's hard. I mean, I'm not sure, because I kind of listen to a wide range of sort of eclectic stuff, and none of the artists that I listen to have huge catalogs, and it depends on what I was doing, right? If I had all my computers with me and I could do anything other than listen to music, but I could work on things, then I could bring some of the music I listen to in the background when I'm working on things.
What would that be? What would that be?
Yeah.
I sometimes listen to kind of odd electronica, like Wax Taylor sort of remixed stuff.
Yeah.
Bjork in the background, the non-vocal stuff for the most part, where I can't quite understand what the lyrics are, but it's just sort of a rhythm and background.
EDM kind of a vibe.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to like listen to that if I weren't doing something. I mean, that's the problem. It's like I have some music that works. Like in college, the music that I could write most efficiently to embarrassingly enough, was Supertramp. I could
What's wrong with
I could crank out like 2,000 words an hour on Supertramp.
Breakfast in America is a totally productive.
Yeah,
totally
yeah,
productive.
absolutely. But that doesn't work for me anymore. I'm not sure why. So I would not want to take Supertramp as my one.
Your working music background. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I'm not sure I have a clear second.
All right.
Fair
Chris,
enough.
How about you? We've given you a little bit more time to think, but
Contrary to appearances, I actually have the answer for this question.
Snap!
But first of all, if you're on the island and the volleyball's not talking back to you, it's not a scam. Volleyballs don't talk, So the first one is a pretty probably boring and pedestrian one, which would be U2. However, for those who are not aware, there's actually some acute psychological insight in U2 lyrics. For example, there's a line where Bono sings, "Some people have way too much confidence, baby," which is certainly something that I think, I agree with and is something to watch out for when being scammed. And the other one is Bob Mould, who was the main singer for Husker Du and then for Sugar, and then had a solo career in between those, and ever since, and various other sort of random bands that he performs. I've seen him play live many times, and at the whole island, like the sound is much better. I won't lose my hearing or something like that from having that loud, that loud stuff. So,
oh man, well, Minneapolis, Husker Du, I got Bob Mould, and
exactly.
they are my hometown here. So,
and Chris, so Dan, you can listen to music with less lyrics, it sounds like, while you're working.
Yeah,
to some degree. Chris, how about you? Can you actually listen to music while you're working?
I'm sure I can, but for some reason I never do it. I actually fairly rarely just listen to music. The time I usually do it is when driving.
Okay.
And honestly, I don't know why this is. I used to listen to more music. I used to go to more live shows, back in grad school and postdoc and afterwards and so on. I think it's just sort of part of some kind of aging process. Like you sort of start to pay less attention to, what's coming out. So, but sometimes, especially when I'm driving at night, I think it's really good to have some loud music playing to help with the attention and so on, because listening to audiobooks is great, but they can put you to sleep sometimes, and you don't want that while you're in the car.
I've missed exits sometimes by listening to audiobooks because I get so into it, and it's like I'm going, oh yeah, and then it's like, oh wait, I'm like miles past where I needed to turn off.
Yes, it has happened. Yeah,
so
it's less distracting somehow.
Yes.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Dan and Chris, it is an absolute joy to have both of you on Behavioral Grooves. Thank you for being guests today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was great chatting.
Yeah, that was a fun conversation. Thanks.
Welcome to the Grooving Session, where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Dan and Chris, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our tomfoolery brains.
Ooh, I love that.
Tomfoolery. We get fooled. We're fooled often. I'm fooled often,
Do you have a great story about when you got fooled?
Do you want me to go on
one
and
of,
on
one,
and on
one
and
of the
on
greater
for
ones.
hours? I don't know. I mean, I've gotten taken. Well, you tell the story of your painting, your Bali painting. What was the,
So Katie and I are in Bali, and we asked the driver to take us to a fine art gallery, and drops us at a place, and all it has is art, and we like a bunch of it. Some of it doesn't look so great, but we find a little print that we think is really cool. And the owner of the place says it's $135, and we're told everything is negotiable in Bali. So I offer something less, and then he says, no, that's impossible. And then I offer something less, and he says, no, that's impossible. And we go back and forth for about 45 minutes. It's quite long. And we end up at $35. And finally, Katie kind of says, can we just buy the damn thing? I'm like, yes. Okay. So we buy it, and we go on and we do the rest of the things that afternoon.
So $135 to start, you negotiate 45 minutes, get it down to 35. Pretty good deal. You are a negotiation wizard.
later that afternoon, we end up at the grocery store picking up a few supplies, and there's a little art area, and they have boxes of prints. And oh my gosh, we stumble upon the very same print. Not only the very same print, but in the very same frame for $8.
That fine art and the fine art. It was almost as though you were on a cruise ship, Tim. Almost as though you're buying art on a cruise ship.
Just like that. Okay. Enough for personal anecdotes. It does remind me, though, that it's not just about the scammers. Let's actually think about the victims here, about the people who get scammed. I think that so much gets sensationalized. Chris brought this up about how sort of the scammers get the Hollywood treatment.
Yeah.
The dashing con artists, I think he said. I think that it's worth thinking about the people and their families in retail environments and consumer markets, especially. Like, let's think about them, about the revenue that gets lost and the faith that we lose in brands as well when this happens. I think this also happens in corporations. I work at an organization that is extremely focused on making sure that there is no retribution for whistleblowers. Mm-hmm. That if you see someone doing something unethical, doing it wrong, not following procedures, that teammates can raise their hand and say, "I don't think this looks right." Yeah. And there's no retribution.
Yeah, I think that's cool. Going back to the Hollywood treatment, right? It is the DiCaprio, right? Wasn't he in Catch Me If You Can? Right? They're talking about the con artist who, did all these things, and they idolized him, not the victims of all of the cons. Right?
Exactly.
And that, I think, is important. And again, to your point, I think the interesting piece of this is that you talk about, like, in corporations and the no retaliation, but if you don't do that, right, then you start to lose trust in the institution. If there are people who are scamming others or taking advantage of. Adam Grant talks about givers and takers, right? And this idea that if you have too many takers and not enough, and then they take advantage of the givers, it leads to a bad culture overall and a variety of other factors in there. And then you go, the next iteration of this, I think, is in academia, right? In this idea where we talk about, and this, we're going to groove on this on a whole separate issue, the idea of fraud in academia and even just in kind of pushing the limits on some of the stuff. But then, all right, so you're an author who did that, but the implications that has for your co-authors and other researchers and the institution.
Yes. Yeah.
As well
all
as
that.
Just, people like you and me who are out there going, I want to believe. And now I don't believe anymore.
Well, so we're practitioners. You are out there proclaiming the messages that you learned through published papers. Yeah. And what happens when that published paper is then removed? You have to go back in and not just relook at what your story was, but represent. Do you go back to all those clients and say, oh, what I told you was wrong?
Oh, by the way, we shouldn't have moved that signature line to up front because it doesn't really matter. And, so you just spent, and here, I'll just refund you all this money because you spent it. Yeah, that doesn't really happen. So it's hard. And it gets, we tend to think about that from research, but, there's also just those overarching kind of concepts out there that, hey, humans, only use 10% of our brain, right? Well, that's bullshit. And
this has been around for a long time.
Takes 7 years to digest chewing gum. No, it doesn't. No, that's not how it works. Goldfish have 3 or 5 second attention spans. No, that hasn't been proven, right? It's
like one study, quote unquote, comes out, and then you think, oh, well, that's sensational, so it must be true. It's vivid, and then we believe that. How about sugar makes kids hyper?
Well, yeah, it does.
Yeah, guess what? There is double-blind research that proves that the sugar is no different than the placebo.
No.
Yeah.
No,
I know it's
come
hard.
on.
It is hard to disengage from things that we accept as truths.
And
this is the knowing this.
That's the other piece, I think, that Chris or Dan, I can't remember who brought it up, this idea of, all right, so you have that initial kind of splashy research that's out there. And then how much, when it doesn't replicate, when it doesn't kind of hold true, how many pieces of information need to come out before that perception gets dislodged?
Right.
And again, I go back, you look at the fraudulent studies on autism being caused by vaccines. That was a fraudulent study to begin with. It was proven within like a year that was a fraudulent study, that was made up. And yet that fostered this entire belief system that now has its own little world that circulates bad research, trying to be motivated reasoning to prove their point because they now believe that. And I think that is just really hard.
Large scale ripple effects from bad information and bad research, bad studies, bad scams. All these things have long arms. I think that's an important thing to call out here. How about you, Kurt? What's on your mind for grooving on?
Well, one of the pieces that I was really kind of fascinated in, or maybe it was what I was thinking about, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it felt, or it feels like fraud is growing, that there is more fraud, at least in the academic world that you and I kind of we like to operate in.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if it really is actually happening, or if we're just paying more attention to it, or it being uncovered more. Was there always this fraud and we just ignored it? But this idea that fraud across the board, not just in academia, but across the board, is growing. And, what did you find out? Because I know you looked up some of this stuff.
Well, I did. And it is kind of interesting that in academia, we don't have a lot of record of fraud in the past. There just hasn't been that much. And so a little bit looks like a lot. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, some of the critics are saying, well, it looks like a lot. Okay, so there's two sides of the coin. The one side is it looks like a lot, but really there are thousands of studies published every year. And we've found 4 this year that have been published over the last 10 years that are fraudulent. So let's not blow it out of proportion. The base rate is still that things are solid. The other side of the coin is we don't fully understand all of the fraudulent studies. This could be the tip of the iceberg, and there could be many, many more that have not been uncovered. So I think the jury's kind of out on that. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the short story.
What about corporations?
Well, about half of all online bank accounts that are opened are fraudulent.
Half.
Yeah. So that feels like it makes the insider trading and insider information from 20 years ago seem kind of weak.
When I feel like I'm going, my gosh, the research seems like it's a gold standard double, up right there, right? I think that's amazing when you think about the fraud and the other part. So there is this also piece that, hey, we have deep fakes. We have the ability today with technology to scam people a lot easier, and with more hey, you hear this voice, it's the real voice of this person, or see this video of this person, or this picture of this person. And all of a sudden you're going, well, hey, if I see it, I believe it, right?
Or if I hear it.
I believe it. And I think the bigger piece of this is one of the pieces I can't remember where I heard this, so I apologize. But there was the component of saying, all right, so you go back to Trump in the 2016 election, and he had the whole video or the audio recording with a little bit of video from the Inside, Tonight or whatever that show was that he was talking.
Hollywood
Insider, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The idea that he was talking about, I can, any woman I want and grabbing pussy and all that kind of fun stuff that he talked about, fun being in air quotes there, folks. I'm not saying it was fun, but the bigger piece of that is, all right, we never doubted that he said that, right? And he didn't even deny it necessarily when it came out. If that would come out today, the first response from somebody who said that would be, well, that's a deep fake. Yeah, I didn't say that. That was totally manufactured. Right? And that would be a perfectly valid kind of response for a lot of people because that is what's happening. So I'm less worried about like the deep fakes that are like saying something and creating something that is going to say, oh, this person did this bad thing. But it's almost as bad of saying, I'm a bad person. I did this and now I don't have any repercussions from it because I can always claim that it wasn't me.
Yeah. There's no culpability because the deep fakes are so good. You can just say, well, that wasn't me. That was AI. Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about our conversation was when we were talking about who do we trust?
I trust you too. I do, even though at the beginning I said I didn't. I do. You're the guy I trust.
Well, that's your first mistake. But I thought Chris summed this up really, really nicely when he was talking about maybe the people that we trust the most are the ones who are authentic enough and open enough to admit their mistakes, to admit that they've changed their mind, which goes all the way back to Josh Turnbull.
Yeah.
Many, many episodes ago about that story that his grandfather told about, I start the conversation with one perspective and then I get new information and then I end the conversation with another perspective. And I can do that. I can change my mind. Changing my mind can be a good thing. It doesn't have to be looked down upon.
Yeah, it's not a flip-flop and all these different pieces, right? If I get new information, I should build that information into my assessment. And if I don't, that's actually the bad part. And so to the point, what we talked about earlier, right? We get that first novel experiment. We get that first information about what's happening and we anchor in on that. And that is a big piece to really say, no, we need to just hold that with a little bit of flexibility to say, all right, I will change my mind. I will change my viewpoint if there's contrary information. And the people that do that are the people that we should trust. They're the ones who are out there experimenting, looking, and being around this component. I think that's a really good piece as we think about that. So I just want to let you know I've changed my mind on a lot of things, and I held different viewpoints today than I did yesterday. Just saying.
I'm struggling with a couple, man.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else, Kurt? What else?
No. What about you? What's your?
There was one tip that Chris offered. I think it might just be worth noting that when it comes to how do we sort of manage the skepticism meter, he kind of pointed to this idea that wait to be skeptical on the big issues.
Yeah.
That's not a bad way to go.
Right.
Because it could get fatiguing if you're skeptical of everything and everybody all the time.
Yeah. So like I should be skeptical of the waiter when I ask, should I pick the fish versus the steak? And I should be really skeptical when he says steak because that's the $50 entree and the fish is only $42. Right. And I'm going, oh, he just wants that extra $8. So I tip him more.
I don't think that would be a big enough issue. But you can be skeptical of that, and there's good motivation behind that. So there's a good argument to be made that could happen. But let's focus on the big issues.
All right.
Look at the sources. Look at where where look at the motivations, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, understand. Really think about this from the big piece, and you can be skeptical about the waiter, but that's a lot of mental power and work that you're doing that probably could be better used in other places. So.
Right. If you can afford to be in a restaurant where they're charging $42 for fish and $50 for steak, does it really freaking matter?
And the difference in the, the quality of your meal at that point. Yeah. So there you go. All right. Well, Tim, I know that for me, this was one of at least 2023's coolest discussions that I've had. You think?
Bada bing, bada boom.
Right.
This was magic on a stick.
Yeah. I mean, this was getting to talk to a couple of our heroes. I mean, seriously, it was there are literature, research, we're fanboys, and we got to talk to them.
And they were terrific guests.
Yes.
Right. I think most importantly, I can imagine that lots of groovers will take away some really important points from our discussion. And for me, the big takeaway is that should we regulate the level of skepticism depending on the size of the issue? Yes, we should. I think we should regulate. Don't use skepticism. Don't dole it out evenly. That's kind of my big thing. How about for you?
I think the piece for me is a couple pieces, but I think one is just honest people are the ones, like, who do we trust? We trust the people who aren't always sure, that are questioning, that are skeptical of their own belief systems sometimes. And those people who come across as always being right, never changing their mind, right? Maybe the honest people are the ones who admit that they were wrong.
Yeah. So growers, we hope that this week you can incorporate some of these tips into your decision making. And we hope that it will help you go out and find your groove.
Or keep your groove. There's lots of people who are already in their groove and they just might want to stay there, Tim.
Yeah, but what about those who haven't found their groove yet? I mean, shouldn't we focus on them just a bit more? Should we think about getting people into their groove?